This week we look at God's mission in the Old Testament, Wright chapters 3 to 8. First, we take a look back. Last week we talked about mission is God's mission, mission singular. And 2, every Christian has a role to play in God's mission. And finally, missions are what we do to fulfill our part in God's mission. Wright makes clear that God's mission can be seen throughout the Old Testament. It is evident throughout the whole Old Testament. It was initiated in creation. It was clarified in God's call to Abraham, and it was exemplified in Exodus. Wright stresses that mission begins with creation. Human beings were created in God's image, and human beings were given authority over creation, but they were also made servants of creation. And he points out that all creation is intricately bound together, and all of creation suffers because of sin, and all of creation is included in God's redemptive plan. According to Wright, Abraham was God's greatest missionary. He says that God called Abraham to be the instrument through which God would bless the rest of the world, and the instrument through which God would save the rest of the world. God's call to Abraham involved election. He was chosen to be a part of God's mission. It involved ethics, because he was called to live according to God's standard in an evil world. And he was called to mission, which involved bringing a blessing to the nations. It seems to me that that's exactly what God calls us to do when he calls us to be a part of his mission. Wright views the Exodus as a holistic event. He points out that the people of Israel were enslaved in at least 4 different ways. First, they were enslaved politically. They were immigrants and an ethnic minority. They were enslaved economically because they worked as slaves in a foreign land. They were enslaved socially. They were dominated by the ruling people. They were enslaved spiritually. They were not able to worship God as they wanted to, and God called them out so that they could worship him. And Wright points out that when God brought deliverance, he brought deliverance in all areas. The Israeli people represented God to their world, and that involved the past, the present, and the future. It involved the past because they recalled where they had been and how God had delivered them. It involved the future because they got a glimpse of God's vision for all nations. And it involved the present because they were responsible to live according to God's law. And the thing was that others were attracted to God when they saw the Israelites living in obedience to God's law. And certainly the same can be said for us today. When Christians live close to God and people see a difference in the lives of the Christians, it attracts them to God. All too often, Christians live as close to the world as they can, and they want to be as much like the greater society as they possibly can, when God has called us out to be different and for people to see a difference in our lives and the lives of those who don't follow God. here are some notes for us. God's call to us parallels his call to the Israeli people during the Exodus. They were elected, chosen to be a part of God's mission. They were called to be ethical, live according to God's standard. And they were called to participate in God's mission, which meant bringing a message of blessing, reconciliation, and redemption to the nations. The Exodus experience also applies to Christians. God's grace brought us out of sin and made us his people. Second, the importance of living our faith in our daily lives cannot be overemphasized, because living in obedience to God attracts others to God. But when we fail to live in obedience to God and we don't live out our faith in our daily lives, others are repulsed. Next week, we will finish reading Wright, chapters 9 to 15. Start thinking ahead. Plan for your congregational study. The first part of that study, the ethnographic notes, will be due on November the 4th, 2017. You should select a congregation other than the one you usually attend. You should plan to visit it at least 3 times before the notes are due. Include in the notes, plan on interviews and observations during a service, have conversations with members of the church, collect literature, note the physical setting, and identify themes that the congregation follows. Don't wait till the last minute. Begin planning now. I strongly advise you to read Agrippino before week 6 and think about the congregation that you will choose to study. Finally, this is something extra. You can view a video of Christopher Wright, who was one of the keynote speakers at the Lausanne conference held in Cape Town, South Africa in 2010. You can listen to the presentations online, and the link that's in this PowerPoint should take you to that. You should be able to click on it, hold Control, and click on it, and it should take you to the link. If that fails, then copy and paste it into the your browser and it will come up. This is not a required activity, it's just something extra if you're interested, but I think if you do decide to listen to Chris Wright's talk, you will find it very worthwhile.